I'm very excited to welcome Madeleine Blais to PMP. Madeleine has a long and illustrious career in journalism at the Boston Globe, the Trenton Times, with PNP owner Brad Graham, and the Miami Herald, where she won a Pulitzer Prize for feature writing. Since then, she's published 4 books, including The Heart is an Instrument, a collection of her journalism, Uphill Walkers, a memoir, and In These Girls, Hope is a Muscle, the story of a girls' high school team from basketball team from Amherst, Massachusetts. She's here today to discuss her 4th book, To the New Owners, a portrait of Martha's Vineyard, her family, and their home on the island. The Kirkus Review wrote that the book has the flavor of a finely observed travel book, with Blais offering a brief history of the island and a thorough inventory of its hierarchy, traditions, and manifest, sometimes eccentric, pleasures. In her hands, it is an endearingly quaint community, though not without a tinge of snob appeal, which she gamely dissects. Please join me in welcoming Madeleine Blais.
Hello, everyone. If you can't hear me, yell or wave, or should I speak louder right now? Is this better? Okay. I'm thrilled to be here at Politics and Prose. I've been in and out of this store many times. The last reading I was here for is actually referenced in this new book because it was for a book that I had written that also came out in the summer, and Catherine Graham was here. I'm going to talk about her a little bit later in this presentation. Before I do that, I want to welcome my friends who are here and also the many people who I don't recognize, but I'm even just as thrilled to see you, whoever you are. I want to also give a shout out to Bradley Graham. I know because many of you come to this store often for events, you know who he is. He was indeed my colleague at the Trenton Times many years ago, but more than that, when we both showed up at the Trenton Times during the brief time it was owned by the Washington Post, we were looking for housing, and we ended up becoming housemates, which back in the 70s was a very daring thing for a man and a woman to do. We were practically sitcom material because it was so edgy. Brad was a wonderful young reporter who was given by the managing editor, or by the editor of the Trenton Times, the executive editor, Richard Harwood, what was considered one of the best beats for a young person really sharpening his teeth on journalism and politics. He was going to cover the city hall, the mayor of Trenton, New Jersey. But Brad had the misfortune of being assigned to cover the only honest politician ever in the history of New Jersey. He'd come home day after day. I'd say, "How did it go? Did you get any dirty?" He said, "No, he makes me stand there, and there's never any sidebars, any hidden conversations. The tape, the tapes are rolling. I get everything. He calls me at night. He wants me every vote. I'm there. So there's nothing hidden, nothing in the alleyways or anything. So he braved this beat for a couple of years and eventually went forward. And I think at one point he left journalism briefly and got his MBA before coming back here to the Washington Post, which of course the MBA resulted in running this store. So we're lucky that he took that break for a while. The book I'm going to present on, To the New Owners, was published on July 4th. And when I told my son, who is a film person, that it was coming out on that particular day, he said, "Great." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, isn't that the day that all the blockbuster films come out?" And I said, "But that could be competition." And then I thought, America, you have a choice. Batman the 20th or a quiet memoir about a family set on an island off the coast of New England. Which is going to win your heart? Tonight, I'm going to read a little bit from the book here and there, a couple of small patches, so to speak, but I'm going to try to talk as much as possible. So I will read and talk. The way I've structured the presentation is I'm going to ask myself questions, as if I were Oprah or somebody. What prompted you to write To the New Owners? In 2014, the family I married into, my in-laws, put a house on the market, a house on a beautiful pond, Great Tisbury Pond, on Martha's Vineyard. It was a house that was surrounded by water because it was on a pond, and the pond itself led to the ocean. So it was a beautiful, beautiful setting at the end of a 2.2-mile-long dirt road. I never thought of it as my house, in the sense that I had married into the family. It had always belonged to my parents-in-law. They bequeathed it to their 4 children. It was theirs. So when I was helping dismantle the house and pack it up, I asked myself, where was my perspective? Why did I feel so bad about this? I do know as a writer that whenever you're filled with mixed feelings or misgivings or tormented thoughts, that's usually good material. So I thought I'm going to try to take notes as I go through this process and try to examine what it meant to have this as part of my life for the many years that it was. We would go there as a family for approximately 2 weeks every summer, which I tried to figure out ways to turn into 17 days and often succeeded. I think the real moment of truth came to me when the movers gave us some red stickers to place on items of value. And I looked around this house. It had been it was a modest house. It was one story. It didn't have a basement. It didn't have air conditioning, didn't have heat. It was left in the hands over the years of these word people, which is to say the members of John's family who are all lawyers and therapists and writers and editors. And they didn't really have they didn't have that engineering sense of how to keep a property up. Plus, it was in battle with the elements every day of its life. So part of the charm of the property was that it was in fact dilapidated and welcomed the weather inside. But we were given these stickers to put on items of value. I looked at the rusty, dusty lantern on the mantle, red sticker. I looked at 2 duck-shaped wicker bread baskets that someone must have thought were a fanciful gift many years ago, and a lot of chipped plates, this Stengel pottery from New Jersey. And I guess I put some stickers on them, but then I looked outside and I thought, how do you put a sticker on a view? Can you wrap it up, smooth out the wrinkles, put it in a styrofoam box surrounded by peanuts? How can you take a view? How can you take the memories? How can you take with you the true meaning of this house as as I dismantle it? How can I pack that? And of course, my thought was, I can do it in the only way I can, through words. These 2 paragraphs summarize the intent of the book, or I would say some of the engine of it. What was most vexing to me about selling the house was that the new owners had no idea what they were getting. They saw 5.5 acres with only a small portion a buildable footprint. They saw the lot and the subdivision numbers by which we were known to the town of West Tisbury, important if it ever needed to send a fire engine our way. They saw a roof that needed replacing and the chance to burden us with half the cost, $17,000. They saw a house they might upgrade, a house they might tear down. The new owners could, of course, imagine their own future happiness, but they could not see, and therefore could not appreciate, the human history preceding the purchase, all the lives that grazed ours, and the ones that truly intersected, the noisy arrivals and departures, the arguments and the recipes, the ghosts and the guests, crabs caught, birthdays celebrated, clams shucked, towels shaken, lures assembled, bonfires lit, the dogs we indulged, the ticks we cursed, the pies we consumed, and through it all, both close by and in the distance, the moving waters, as a poet put it, at their priest-like task. They could not see the depth of the lives lived here during the summer for all those years. I know from talking to many people who've gone through a similar process of dismantling a beloved beach house or even a beloved family home, that it can be a very emotional process, and it's partly because of all those thoughts, those memories that are flooding you as you proceed with this transaction. Next question. You portray Martha's Vineyard as a quiet place. One of your young guests said, coming here is great because I'm having the kind of childhood people had before I was born. Yet, isn't the island chock-a-block with celebrities and CEOs? Answer, actually, it is both. The house that we lived in, because it was so remote, became the place where we spent all our time. We made an island on the island by going to that house. And it also happened to be pretty much unplugged. When I first visited the property, there was a fisherman's shack on it. The fisherman's shack was used by people who lived in Edgartown, sometimes sea captains or whatever, for their time off to come out to this remote area and basically light a fire, probably have some whiskey with them, take their guns and shoot geese, because there was a real pathway for geese above this house. When that shack was torn down and this other house was built, it still remained without electricity when I was first there, used kerosene lighting, no telephone at first, and never, as I said, any heat or anything like that. No air conditioning, a radio that got fuzzy reception that was listened to only from time to time when the Red Sox were on. So you were pretty much in your own world of that beauty. But of course, the island has its other side. It has very, very fancy fundraisers, people who are political running for office. In the summer, you'll see ads in the newspapers or notices of very high-toned prep schools and colleges are having cocktail parties or gatherings for accepted students or for alums. And there'll be there's a wonderful annual auction called the Possible Dreams Auction that Art Bookwald used to MC, where prominent people donate something that they're comfortable donating, and then probably somewhat prominent people pay for these things, and all the money goes straight to the island coffers. Thus, it feeds the well-off people's vanity and sense of generosity, and it also helps people on the island do better during the winter when things can get pretty tough. The rumor now is that Barack Obama has bought a house there, but that's just a rumor. Another rumor is that Lady Gaga has a house on Chappaquiddick. Also, I think that's really just a rumor, but that's the kind of place it is. What has been the reception of the book thus far? Okay. It's gotten mostly excellent reviews. It did get one that wasn't so excellent, which was a bit of a challenge, but whenever I get a bad review any place, I know I have at least one trick up my sleeve, and that trick is that my husband is a thriller writer, and every year on my birthday he gives me the chance to name a villain in a future work. My birthday's in August. I have to tell you, though, I don't really do that. I just think about it. But I also was on Morning Edition. Is Samantha here? Samantha Balaban? Samantha, can you stand up? Just a second. Okay, thank you. The book crossed the desk of Samantha Balaban a few weeks ago, and she alerted her boss, Scott Simon, that it might be worthy of an interview. Samantha is a student that I worked with at the University of Massachusetts, where I teach. She graduated in 2010. She wrote the most brilliant profile that a young person has written under my many years of teaching long-form journalism. It was of the wife of the then Chancellor of the University of Massachusetts, who was a sort of a colorful figure from Europe, married to an older man. Think a not depressed Melania and this older fellow and this profile that when it was published, people would say, "Did you see this piece of writing?" I'd be quoted to me as a really excellent look at somebody. It was Samantha who did it. So Samantha, when I was interviewed by Scott, he said, this young producer wants to say hello. I said hello, and then I thought, 30 years of teaching has paid off. An excerpt of the book appeared in Vanity Fair. It was the excerpt was what Kay Graham brought to the table, and it was a profile of Mrs. Graham and a once-a-year annual friendship we had. Because this is a Washington audience, I think there are names that would be familiar to you that might not be so familiar to people outside of this area. I met Mrs. Graham at a funeral service for Howard Simons, who was the managing editor of the Washington Post on the night of the Watergate. It wasn't a burglary, right? It was break-in, Watergate break-in. And he ended up, in the fullness of time, becoming the director of the Neiman program at Harvard, where I met my dear friend Athalia Knight, who's in the audience. He died at much too young an age. There was a service for him. I came down to the Post. I talked to Mrs. Graham because of being close to Howard, whom she had loved, and she knew that my in-laws, the Katzenbachs, I should have said their name earlier, had this house on the Vineyard, and she said, "Well, listen, when you're going to be there?" I told her the date. She said, "Well, when you get there, you have to call me." So for the next 4 weeks, I was just walking around. I have to call Mrs. Graham. I have to call Mrs. Graham. I have to call her. And so I got there, and I did, and we ended up making a date to have lunch. And every year, either we would see her at her place, which was called Mohu, a grand estate, or she would come to our place, which, though extremely lovely, was much more down to earth in its amenities, at any rate. In the article in Vanity Fair and in the book, it mentions that at one point I served her lobster for dinner because I thought, okay, that's the most democratizing thing you can eat. You wear a bib. Everything's exploding all over you. You're cracking things. It's everything's squirting up. So that was good because we were all on the same level. The next time she came, I bought the finest swordfish I could get at John's Fish Market in Vineyard Haven, and I prepared it because I'm the queen of kitchen hacks and of going with local food and therefore keeping it fresh. It's the easiest thing to do. So I prepared it by applying a very, very thin membrane of store-bought mayonnaise over its entirety, top and bottom. We put it on the grill. The mayonnaise sealed in the flavor of the fish. And afterwards, she just loved it. But she loved it so much that she wanted me to share my recipe with her French chef. She was such a good person in some ways that she tried to make it seem we were on a level playing field. And I remember thinking, oh yeah, we really are, as hostesses, on a level playing field. If only I had a French chef and routinely invited world leaders to my table, we would be so simply, perfectly matched. But there's a fairly long portrait of her in the book. There are also long portraits of other people, including Nicholas Katzenbach, who was my father-in-law, former Attorney General of the United States, best known for many things, but I think possibly most known for the moment in which he stood in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama and forced George Wallace to integrate that school. Where did I put my glasses? Here they are. Okay, so. I also wanted to mention that the book tries to capture the island in the off-season as well. In the off-season, Martha's Vineyard reverts to form, and it is a quintessential New England place. Yes, there are still fancy people there, and there are people living on beautiful properties, but winter takes over. So the island is more about light and the lack of light, more cold and what to do about it than it is about the fancy fundraisers. So I wanted to do my best to capture that, and I tried to make allusion to things that happen during the winter that don't happen during the summer. For instance, at Thanksgiving every year, the school children at one of the public schools makes about 75 pies to deliver to people who on a list who've signed up because they can't get the pie for themselves. They would like it. Pie is the only dessert allowed on the island, except maybe fudge. But really, pie is the only thing that people eat, basically. And there are other things that happen on the island during the winter that show that it's actually, at its heart, in many ways, a small, close-knit community. So, next question. Do you have a favorite chapter? No favorites, however. I am proud of the portrait of my mother-in-law, Lydia Katzenbach, who spent her 8 years in Washington married to a very powerful man and got to be in the center of power from the periphery. I'm sure that that's a story that's told in Washington many times over with great frequency. She was once the subject of a Herblock cartoon. There was a woman sort of talking to her husband. She was very frustrated with him, and she said she was trying to teach him how to dance. And the caption is something like, "How will I ever get an invitation to Lydia's if my baboon of a husband can't even do the monkey?" So that was her block. But when I met John's parents, I come from a very different kind of family. One way to summarize the family I come from is not only that my mother was widowed with 5 children under the age of 8 and pregnant with the 6th, that as we went through life and grew up, we went to college. 5 of us, one didn't, one was very ill. But 5 of us went to college. We all went to Catholic schools or to public universities. And at one point I was thinking with John, how do I play the Cape Cod Community College card? Will his family understand my family? Because his family, people, and his father went to Princeton and then on to Yale. He had a Rhodes Fellowship. It was a different level of experiencing the world. To put it really simply, my Irish Catholic family adored the Kennedys. They knew them. So I was often asked, what was it like to marry into a different kind of family? Now, before you think, well, why is she writing about this family? Why not her own? I did write a memoir about my own family. So I ran out of them, so I had to start on other families. With John's father, I think there are some people in this room who might remember him. He died, as I say, in 2012. He was a very gentle, kind of giant type person, very soft-spoken, gravelly voice. You know, he got George Wallace to just melt in the sun in 1 second just by standing over him. Or I'm exaggerating now, but he really was a person who knew how to make things happen. I did feel intimidated by him. If I was asking, for instance, for the salt and pepper at table, I would try to make a point about the Constitution if I could, or a recent headline, just so that I radiated enough gravitas to, keep things on the level that they seem to be. But it was John's mother who truly threw me for a loop. Lydia's sister, Bunty, is right there in the third row. Do you mind raising your hand, Bunty? Maybe, yeah, she's here. So she's here to make sure that I don't say anything against her sister, which I won't. I want to say that William Butler Yeats once said that there is no greater courage that a man shows than entering the abyss of his soul. But I would like to say there is no greater, to criticize William Butler Yeats, but there may be no greater courage that a woman can show than to write about her mother-in-law when she is alive, sentient, and capable of revenge. So this chapter was written knowing how brave I was. But let me just read a couple of paragraphs about Lydia to explain the kind of person that she was in many ways, or is. At one of our first meetings, she leaned over and said, sotto voce, "Missoni is your designer." With that quick phrase, I was ushered into the world of fancy salons and private fittings, knighted. I was ushered out just as quickly when she said, "Of course, you'll have to learn to use a little makeup." A classic example of the push-pull inherent in the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law equation. Lydia cited ancestors who were the subjects of paintings by Turner in the National Gallery, the way someone else might reference how an aunt's famous marshmallow jello salad was always a big hit at the company picnic. When she was sick, she was provided with the same doll as Queen Elizabeth because, well, of course. Like FDR, she could not wait to be a traitor to her class, to break out of her inherited caste system and to find her way into a more fluid society. She aspired to a certain bohemian outrageousness and never stopped beaming from an early school report. Lydia is a born leader, but in the wrong direction. In presenting her to you, my readers, I contemplated how, at a certain point in her life, towards the end of her years in Washington, she went into psychoanalysis as a patient. And when she came out, she decided that she wanted to undergo the training, which is quite extensive for even a lay psychoanalyst, which is what she ended up being, to practice that profession. And it meant a great deal to her to are you a colleague? Or I can't remember. I know who you are. You're the mother of Lydia, right? Yeah. They named their child after her. So there's godmother. And Lydia is the godmother of your beautiful daughter. Yeah, big Lydia. Okay. Maybe you can speak. Well, maybe you can say something about her. I don't know. I'll just say this: that in the book, what I realized in trying to contemplate this part of my life and going over her relationship with my children, in particular when they were growing up, how absolutely terrific she was. There's a letter in here that my son wrote about how he wanted a BB gun, and his parents, wouldn't let him have it. So we went to her with this request, and she wrote back the most fantastic letter, trying to understand what it's like to be an 8-year-old boy and want a BB gun more than anything, when that's probably not a good idea. She also, in this chapter, I won't read it, I think it would make me cry to read it in some ways. She once shared a letter that she sent to a patient who had a child who had terrible difficulties and come back from a college trip or college semester abroad, really a wreck. And in the letter, she tries to tell this person, who is a parent, the best way to react to someone who's suffering in that particular way. And It's a document that is quite beautiful. You'll see that this book has quite a few quotes from other people. I always think that it's because as a journalist, I think everybody says things better than I do. So there is a documentarian quality here. There are letters quoted, but most of all, the quotes you'll see are from the logs, which were ship's logs that we bought when the new house was built, the new house that eventually became the old house that got sold. And we would write in these logs all the time. Some of the things that people put in the logs were very profound. Sometimes they were just cheesy teenage blah or pure drivel. But they did write. They sometimes rose to great occasions of writing and of heartfelt annotations about the trips to the vineyard. I'm going to read a couple from a woman who worked for Consumer Reports. Her name was Leslie Weir. And when she came to the island with her husband, Phil Caputo, who's a writer, who was described as the ideal guest, you'll see a whole chapter about him. He's a brilliant writer who has a new novel out, Summarized by Sin, but also in a few months, the 40th reissue of his memoir, Rumor of War, will be published. So they were just wonderful people to have visit from time to time. She would write in the logs as if she were a Consumer Reports person coming to evaluate the property, one of their testers. A beach house must be adjacent to at least 100 feet of crushed sand with water in the distance. It must be a walled structure with a roof and preferably wooden shingles that have turned brownish from exposure to aforementioned water. Our panel of staffers journeyed all over for the quintessential beach house. We found a clear winner. Consumer Reports rates the beach house 2,000. Our testers spent 3.89 days in the residence, shifting between two different rooms. Average temperature 68.7, total rainfall 10 inches, all during a 5-minute period. Total number of fish caught 0, nada, zip, as usual. 2001, fishing. What can I say? The providers let their women down again. Instead of a striped fish, the fishermen caught 24 sugar donuts. 2002, fishing. Nothing, not even an anchovy. 2004, fishing. Poor. We have lost any memory of what a real whole fish looks like. 2007, fishing. Holy mackerel. Phil actually hooked and brought home a striped bass, silver and blue, 29 inches. Nope. 31, no, 32, 33, whatever. The manly men grilled it, and it was good and true. So she's just Leslie Weir, the author of all those Consumer Reports citations, is getting quite a bit of shout-outs in the many reviews. I think maybe she should write her own Consumer Reports style book about a beach house. Anything else you want to add? Not too much. I would just like to say that one of the greatest challenges of marrying into John's family was growing accustomed to the degree to which they love their animals. You had to love their animals as much as they did and more. And one of them was a dog named Beowulf, a Great Dane, meaning it was that big, that would like jump on you. And sometimes if it got near the dining table, would wait when there was a moment of inattentiveness and then slip its tongue out and take a whole stick of butter into its mouth. And instead of people saying, that's disgusting, they'd say, oh, Beowulf, that's so funny, And John's sister, Anne, is a wonderful contributor to the logs and therefore to this book. She used to write haikus that she claimed were written by her pug Daisy about being on the island. I'm going to read 3 of them. Manifesto. I am on the couch. In comfort and defiance, I am on the couch. Agenda. I am sleeping here, and when I am done with that, I will be sleeping there. Edgartown. When I am on the town, the people love to touch me. Why not? I'm pretty. Okay. One last point. This book is about many things. Clearly, it's a book about the power of place. When I teach my writing students at the university and at Goucher College, where I'm a mentor in their low residency MFA program in nonfiction, which is actually going on now. I snuck away for an evening to be here. One of my mottos is nothing happens nowhere. So I love to write about place and love to think about place as a character that exerts an influence on the real human characters. So this is a book about place. It's a book about memory, marriage, raising children, the power of language, dogs, celebrities, even recipes. But mostly it's a book about gratitude. So I'm going to close with a quick anecdote and then a quote. The anecdote is this. When John's parents were in Washington, they were invited to what was a fairly well-known or historically well-known state dinner honoring President Charles de Gaulle and his wife, Madame de Gaulle. And at this event, you know more than I do. You know, the formal events, everyone's hovering. If somebody says anything, people get silent. Even if it's not that funny, they laugh uproariously because they're nervous, all that. Well, at this dinner, Mrs. de Gaulle, Madame de Gaulle, decided to offer an opinion about something she believed deeply. And so she stunned the table by saying, all anyone in the world wants is a penis. Everyone went, oh my God, what is she trying to convey here? Finally, after much confusion, her husband saved the day and he leaned over and said, what Madame means to say is all anyone wants is happiness. That really happened. You can Google this. Kurt Vonnegut used to tell a story about an elderly uncle who would be sitting under an apple tree, chatting, sipping lemonade, and then he would suddenly interrupt the agreeable blather to exclaim, if this isn't nice, I don't know what is. Vonnegut loved saying this and often urged people to notice when they are happy. Madame de Gaulle would be so pleased. Thank you.
I'm going to visit a couple of friends on the Vineyard in 12 days. Should I take one or two of your books?
Is it two friends?
Two friends, but they live around the corner from each other.
Oh, no, take four. Because
one for each husband? Or?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Have fun on the Vineyard. I will be there in August at a couple of events. They have quite a few literary events, so I'll be presenting at the book fair, but that's not till the first weekend in August. Oh, sorry. Yes.
First of all, thank you for your contribution to Vineyard literature.
This is an author who has also made a contribution too. You should say what you've written, please.
Well, I wrote a book about the Vineyard, and it's called Martha's Vineyard Basketball, How a Resort League Defied Notions of Race and Class. But listening to you, I just realized what the book is about that I didn't realize when I was writing the book and interviewing people for the book. And the reason I didn't realize it is the basketball courts that I wrote about in Niantic Park were built, I think, in 1970, but they had never been repaired, and they were closed last summer for repair, the summer before last for repair. And when they were closed for this long overdue repair, the ire of people who only visit the Vineyard for the summer, and even some year-rounders, about why it was taking so long for the new swings and basketball courts and tennis and other things that they were adding that weren't there in 1970 to be finished, kind of made me think of what you were talking about in terms of place, because a lot of it was directed at people like the Parks and Recreation director, who's a childhood friend of mine, and who used to play basketball on those courts in the 70s and 80s. And a lot of people formed friendships on those courts across social, economic lines, year-rounders and vacationers who would have never met had it not been for the summer league, because their parents don't have anything their parents don't know each other. So they just befriended each other because there was no Facebook back then or digital way to befriend people, so we all met on the courts. But when it was closed, people were angry because their children couldn't use it. People were angry because they had so many memories there because they used to talk to their children and grandchildren about it, or their wives or fiancés. And they were also angry because it was a 45-year pattern that was disrupted and interrupted for repair. So what a lot of people saw as a local issue, because they use the park almost all year, vacationers saw as, why couldn't they have finished it before we got here?
Mm-hmm.
And you're having to sell that house, and the idea that you can still go to the Vineyard, I'm sure, and visit friends, but you don't have the place that the memories are in, reminded me of all the uproar about Niantic Park being closed.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say, I was on the island actually earlier this week because I was with a newspaper reporter who was hoping to do a story about the island, and we went to Menemsha, which is the beautiful harbor where the sunset sets every day when there's sun, and I was with another companion, and we noticed that there was a little pop-up sushi place, and which is new. And I said, and I believe this is really true, that New Englanders resist change as a form of recreation. So this sushi place has become quite the controversy. But it seems like it was a very cruel thing to close down, to blame, to think that the summer guests had more of a purchase on that basketball court than the year-rounders. I didn't know how to really write this book is not about the year-rounders, which is a whole nother beautiful book that could be written. I think about probably an amazing book. And I didn't know exactly how to capture them, but I did try with one essay. A young girl who was one of our family friends who hung out with us. This house, we opened this up to all the children that we knew, just so they had a place to come and feel happy in the summer. She would come and stay with us and with another friend. And she was in some financial struggles herself. She couldn't get one of the kind of cool jobs like at Pandora's Box selling fancy girls' clothes, or at like Atria as a hostess. She had to. It was Atria. I'd never been, but it's a nice restaurant. She worked at Stop and Shop, and at first she was humiliated because of a bunch of things. She hated the uniform. She hated the way it fit. She hated the way it looked. She hated that she was never going to see Tom Hanks while she was at Stop and Shop. And she was somewhat condescending to the people that she worked with at first. And then they started to help her and be kind to her and protect her from lecherous older customers, that kind of thing. And she made quite a few friendships and quite a few forays into their lives, and understood, for instance, that some of the people who worked there lived in not great housing on the mainland, would get up before dawn, take the ferry to the island, and then do 12-hour shifts, and go back on the ferry to the not great housing. And that's the one way in which I tried to capture the island, the struggles of some of the people involved with the island, which are very real. And just the other day when I was there, I thought this was, I was at a house and someone was waiting for their cleaners to come. And we'd knocked on the door, which maybe we shouldn't have, but she said, "Oh, I didn't know who it was. I thought it might be the Brazilians." And Brazilians is now code for the cleaners and the laborers and the workers. Not in my book, but it would have been good had it been. Yes, please.
Hi. So you mentioned your mother-in-law, Lydia, and so what does she think about the book?
She likes it. It's, yeah. Go figure. Actually, I have to say, I really love her, and I loved her. I think she was a real role model for me because she found her way in the world, and she bucked certain traditions as I did. Entering journalism at a time when women were not necessarily particularly welcome. And I feel as even though we came from very different, I didn't have the same doll as Queen Elizabeth or anybody like that. I did have a Betsy Wetsy or something. I was not without a doll. But we both took on the world in our own way. And she does like it. So I'm very grateful for that. Yes, please.
Two things. I was wondering if you say anything in the book about the Ag Fair. And second, if you ended up at some point meeting the new owners.
There's a passage, there's an accidental or a serendipitous meeting with the new owners that's described at the beginning of the book, but we don't know them. It's just they are in some ways a literary conceit. It's an address to people. Anybody who's ever sold a house is when they're packing, if they care about the house, is thinking about the new owners. So it's really, they're not characters in the book. In terms of the Ag Fair, I assume you've been to it. It's this great fair that happens in August over, I guess, a 3-day period where the vineyard becomes, I'd say, almost high New England, and people there are ox pulling teams, and there are big and somewhat competitive battles for the best tomato and the biggest squash. And there's one contest that I really like, which has women throwing skillets in a skillet toss, only women, as if females throwing frying pans is a global impulse. But
this is not a question, but just really a huge shout out. Thank you for bringing the Katzenbachs back to life in Washington. They were marvelous. We were dear, 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 dear friends for many, many years. Lydia became a psychoanalyst because of me, and we traded patients for years when she was in Princeton and then when she was in New York. And I was practicing here, and we would trade students at Princeton back and forth, and she's my daughter's godmother.
You came to my wedding.
And I came to your
And your
wedding.
daughter was a little girl, and her name was Lydia.
Yes, and her name was Lydia, and we still call Big Lydia, and Little Lydia, Little Lydia. She went to Bennington, and so she loved to break the rules. And there were lots of funny, fun stories. For example, I'll just tell one. When they wanted the administrative wives to do a garden tour around Northwest Washington, and they lived on Highland Place. And Lydia didn't want any really didn't want any part of that, but she did want to participate. So she went to Johnson's florist and bought a truckload of geraniums, came back and had them all buried along the path. Bunty's laughing. And then put on a beautiful, maxi dress, as they call it now. And when the people all came on tour, she walked through the geraniums that had been planted that morning and told them about her garden, and then she never went out there again. But they were so much fun, and we went to John's opening of his movie in New York, and Mimi was our first babysitter on the Vineyard. And so you've tied the Vineyard Washington connection together again.
There is a huge Vineyard
There's
Washington
a huge,
connection. Yeah.
We will be leaving a week from today.
Well, I'm free. No, I'm not, but
And we went there
Sometime,
for
I
the first
hope.
time with Nick and Lydia. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Yes.
Two-part question. I was wondering, my son just announced he's getting married, and of course we have always loved this young woman, but this is the topic on my mind. And it's so personal to ask, but I am just wondering if from the very beginning, because you outlined all the, class differences and so on, did you feel accepted or were you accepted? And how did you work your way into it? Because it's both ways, number one. And then the other thing is, like years ago, I think I read a book called The Grab, which, and I can't find it. And, I read so much, and I keep all my books, and I can't find that book. And it's one of those books I really want to reread because it was about Lydia's families going.
John's sister Maria wrote a book called The Grab that came out in 75. It was her honors thesis that she wrote for Princeton University under the supervision of a really wonderful writer named George Garrett. That came out when John and I were dating in Trenton, which David Marinus and Linda Marinus in the audience were part of those days. And I remember we were all thinking, God, here's this real writer, this novelist, and I was really covering Easter egg hunts at the Trenton Y, wondering what would I ever come to, in this world, as I was just so sincerely trying to become a journalist. So the family had accomplishments in it, to say the least, including Mimi. But your question, really part of this book kind of addresses that question. I think you don't know me very well, but I'm actually quite feisty.
And feisty is good in the family?
Feisty was really good. I think the opposite would not have been good.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
I held my own, and I've had a long career teaching and writing, just my own world. So I hope I've held my own. You can read the book and figure it out. Yeah.
Good evening, Ms. Blais. My name is Virgil Young, and I just wanted to say thank you very much. You instantly captivated my thought processes, and I was locked into you as soon as you started talking, and you really transported both me and my wife. She's a librarian. She was at Stanford, but you really transported us back into Martha's Vineyard. I just wanted to say my grandfather bought a cottage in Martha's Vineyard in 1947, and I was
smart man.
I was born in 1959. He was the first board-certified black oral surgeon in the United States, Roscoe Lee. And my question to you is, as you talk about place, you're familiar with the organization called the Cottagers?
Yes.
A group of black women that own property on the vineyard. My question to you is, since you know about property, is there such an equivalent organization for white women? And if so, could you share any information that there may be?
I don't know about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't heard. But your house was, I assume, in Oak Bluffs.
Oak Bluffs,
Yeah,
yes.
the storied
York Avenue.
place where, and I do mention, and once again, there have been novels written about Oak Bluffs, nonfiction books, beautiful books. I allude to them, but that's a whole nother experience of the vineyard. And for a lot of people, at least I assume this from experience, but that the fact that the island had a long history of African American presence for many people was a huge selling point. And that was one of the reasons I know that Lydia was attracted to the island. She felt, now her beautiful sister Bunty's about to say something. Lydia was somewhat upset at times many years ago when she was at an old Adirondack camp, where she felt that the anti-Semitism was particularly in evidence, and it had bothered her a great deal.
And I just want to lastly say your whole concept about place is so key, because there's so many different types of people that converge onto Martha's Vineyard. It is the quintessential convergence or focal point of the world, in a sense. So thank you very much for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you for being here tonight, too. Thank you.
I just want to add to Dr. Miles' story, flesh it out a little bit. Lydia and Nick were asked to give a party for Princess Margaret and Tony Snowden. And the reason the State Department asked them to give that party was because they wanted Princess Margaret and Tony Snowden to have the experience of an all-American family party. That's what they were asked to do. The front field in front of their house was a baseball and football field for the boys. And she did, in fact, go out the day before to Johnson's and order hundreds of geraniums to go there. The party was given, and I won't tell stories about that party, but the next everybody in her family hated those geraniums. The boys couldn't stand them. Lydia hated them, but they did the job of showing the all-American family giving a nice party.
Thank you, Bunty. Thank you very much. There's a story in the book about that party. My husband, John, was really good friends with Craig McNamara, whose father was Robert McNamara. And the boys on the day of the party had been out and about, playing ball, bicycles, running around. Came home around noon, 2, 3 in the afternoon. It was getting late. And observed that there were 12 tiny, as John calls them, little mini steaks in the fridge. And they said, cool, let's just cook some up. So they got some butter or whatever, put them in a pan, let them sizzle. They ate 8 of the 12 mini steaks. Lydia came into the kitchen and to her horror saw that the night's dinner had just been consumed by these teenagers. And this was at a time when grocery stores closed at 5 on Saturday. It was a different world. There was no 24-hour, mini steak place. So, but I guess she called one of the local stores and just in a somewhat forceful voice, the manager said, no, the butcher said, we're about to close. She said, no, you're not. Explained, got in the car, went over, got every steak they had and brought it back to the house. But that party was quite, see, the Katzenbachs are storytellers. They are people who live by language. They love language. We live in a time when language is completely dishonored, I feel. I'm not going to go into great detail about that. But I came from an Irish Catholic tradition, which also believes in language and really believes in honoring it. And so that was part of what really probably made the marriage work, is this idea that what you say matters and how you say it matters. And writing this book captures a lot of how this family said things and how they did things. And it's an honor to be part of their family, an honor to write this book. And I should say that I dedicated the book to Nick and Lydia. So I think I'm going to be taking up more of your time than the bookstore normally encourages. So thank you very much. Thank you. Come on. Thank you.